This video is to show you two ways in which I knit in the round. The first one is where I use a single circular needle, and you would use that technique for knitting something like a cowl like this, or a hat, or a bigger project such as maybe a fair isle throw that you were going to steek. And this is by far and away the simplest way to knit projects in the round, but it isn't suitable for all projects. So the other way that I'm going to show you is using double pointed needles, which you would use to knit something like a mitten, socks typically. This is a little bit more fiddly, but they're both very useful techniques. So I'm going to start with the simplest one of all, which is to knit a project in the round on a single needle. There are a number of things to note here. One is that you have to have enough stitches for the project. It's really important that you have the right number. You can have a fairly crowded needle, but if you haven't got enough stitches, it will either be impossible to knit it, or it will be very tight, and you might actually affect the outcome of the project. So bear in mind that circular needles are measured from tip to tip. Most people know that, but occasionally you'll find some people think it's the cable, which of course then will make it a 60cm long needle. So you need to make sure that, including the cable and the tips, it's whatever length is specified for your pattern. In this case, a 40cm needle. I've cast on all my stitches. I have just about got enough for the length of needle. I think I've got about 80 stitches for worsted weight yarn on 5mm needles. It will feel a little bit tight for the first round, but then it will be fine. Having cast on all my stitches, I am now going to check that they're not twisted, because if they're twisted when you cast on, then you'll have to take it out and start again. You can check for that by just having a look and making sure they're all lying in the same direction. They're all lying flat. I'm satisfied that they're not twisted. So now I'm going to just start to knit in the round, and this is very, very simple. So you just take your stitch marker and put it onto your right hand needle tip, and then just start knitting. The first stitch will feel a little bit tight, and you're just going to go into that stitch and knit it just as normal and carry on through the round like that. And as soon as I've got going, I can tighten it by pulling the tail down there, and then I would just knit round my first round of knitting until I got back to here again. As soon as I see the stitch marker, then I know that I'm ready to start my next round. So that's the first technique, which is really simple. The second technique is showing you how to cast on and begin the setup for a smaller project such as these mittens. So here I'm going to be using double pointed needles, and I know that they're not universally popular, but I think they're very useful because they give you a lot of control over the project. So the way I start my knitting with double pointed needles is to cast on all my stitches onto one needle. There are lots of techniques and videos out there, but this is the way that I generally teach it. I've cast on with my thumb, so I've got my tail and my working yarn both at the same end. That doesn't matter where your tail is, but make sure your working yarn is on the left hand side, and you're going to start working from the end of that first needle. And what I do is, I'm having cast on my full number of stitches, which in this case is 33, which is a bit low, but it'll do. I'm then going to shunt approximately 2/3 of them off the first needle and onto the second needle, just by slipping them. Notice that I am always slipping the stitches purlwise, because that is neutral. If I slip them any other way, then they're going to be twisted. So I'm going to just take approximately 2/3 of these off. By doing this as well, you're kind of loosening up the cast on stitches, so that it does make it a little bit easier for you to get going on that first round. So now I've got more stitches on my second needle, so I'm going to in turn move those up to that end, and I'm going to now take my my third needle and move approximately half of those stitches onto needle number 3. Double pointed needles are generally sold in packs of 5. I almost never need 5. Maybe occasionally you might for a big project where you wanted to spread the stitches out a bit more, or for a sock, but generally 4 needles is plenty. So now I've got my stitches roughly evenly distributed across 3 needles. And as with the project that we cast on first for the cowl, I need to make sure that all my stitches are lying in the same way so that they're not twisted. And then I need to knit with the working yarn, because I'm a right-handed knitter. My working yarn needs to be here on the right, and my tail is there as well, but I'm going to not knit with that. And I need to knit from this needle to this needle. I've got a 4th needle, which I'm going to be using in a minute, but when I start double pointed needle knitting, I don't cast on extra stitches and knit stitches together. I just cast on the number that the project specifies, and then I just knit with 3 needles, which is a bit odd, feels a bit tight, just for the first couple of stitches of the first round. So I just put my stitch marker in place, knit 2 stitches, 2's fine, and then having got them underway, I'm now going to start using needle number 4. So you just ignore these needles really. You're only interested in the needle that you're actually holding in your left hand and the needle that you're holding in your right hand. So the fact that you've got 2 of the needles here is unusual, but it's not, they're not really, you don't need to worry about those. Just knit as you normally would, and bear in mind that when you knit with double pointed needles and you first start knitting with DPNs, it can feel really awkward. They can feel a bit muddled up and jumbled, and you sometimes can sort of feel like you've lost your way with it. But once you've got about a centimetre of work on your needles, really just 4 rounds, it all starts to feel perfectly normal. So I've come to the end of my first needle, and that means that this needle is empty. So that now becomes my right hand needle, and I will knit the next needle. So knitting a needle doesn't mean to say that I finished a round. It just means that I'm moving on to the next needle. When you, if you ever see that your work is looking laddered between the needles where you join as you knit up, you can just do what we did at the beginning. Just use 3 needles for a couple of stitches every, I don't know, 3 or 4 rounds, and close that little ladder up, and then you won't get a ladder there. So I've now knit to the end of my second needle, and when I get to this needle, I'm going to also finish my round. And I can have my stitch marker wherever I want. I just happen to have 2 stitches there holding it in place. So that's how you knit. That's how you start knitting with double pointed needles in the round, and also how you start knitting with a single needle in the round.